Craveable Podcast, Episode 3, Everything About Organic.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, and welcome to the Craveable Podcast, where real matters. We're your hosts, Ben and Katie, and this show is brought to you by Fossil Farms. So today, as the title may have hopefully given away, we are going to discuss everything we possibly can about organic. So I think we should probably start with a definition. So the term organic refers to the way agricultural products are grown and processed. While the regulations vary from country to country, in the United States, organic crops must be grown without the use of synthetic herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, or bioengineered genes, aka GMOs. Additionally, specific to livestock, organic livestock raised for meat, eggs, and dairy products must be raised in living conditions accommodating their natural behaviors, like the ability to graze on pasture, and fed organic feed and forage. They may not be given antibiotics, growth hormones, or animal byproducts. And another interesting fact is that the USDA organic label will definitely be there on all certified products, which actually means that it has a 95% or higher organic content. Ben, do you want to talk about the history of organic by any chance?
I will, because I was born the year that they started doing organic farming, or on a large enough scale that it was worth speaking to. The farmers speak with their peers, and they're like, "We're doing it a certain standard. We're doing it a certain way that's above and beyond regular commercial agriculture." And I think they wanted to differentiate themselves for the sake of their customers more so than how we see now the differentiating being almost an incentive to charge more for the product. They are better products, but that's truly the incentive today. So in Oregon, they actually started off starting with an organic program, and eventually I believe that actually ended up in the hands of the USDA, which is still a little bit of a challenge for people because they think that it should be more on a state level or a third-party auditor or something like that going on. Although I believe they do have some third parties come in through the USDA to certify organic. But I think we're going to really get into what a lot of people in our industry talk about, which is it actually organic? Like, is it by definition organic? Do we feel that it's organic? And I think we almost touch on something really interesting, that 95% or higher. I mean, I like to think that these companies are putting 100% organic in what they're giving us, but there is always that wiggle room. And I think there's a lot of challenges for people to certify organic. And I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on almost everything we will discuss in this episode.
Let's flesh it out a little.
I'm going to rewind. I'm going to take it way back. So the concepts of organic agriculture actually were developed way back in the early 1900s by a couple gentlemen named Sir Albert Howard, F.H. King, and Rudolf Steiner. And they basically believed that the use of animal manures made into compost, cover crops, crop rotation, and biologically based pest controls would result in a better farming system. So it started, at least the concept and idea of it started a long time ago. And then the actual demand, consumer demand for organic food was really stimulated in the 1960s. There was a publication by the name of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which basically documented the extent of environmental damage that is caused by insecticides. So following that, and you mentioned this about 1990, farms in the United States that were being managed organically started to blow up in the 1990s. And that was because the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990 was implemented, and they really started to get to work, the USDA that is, on getting some policies in place. What is this? Let's define it. How can we control it? So the USDA implemented the final National Organic Standards and Rules in October 2002, after a decade of developing that procedure and process. So obviously, organic food sales have been increasing steadily since the late 20th century, but a lot of this is, greater environmental awareness, concerns about animal welfare and health impacts of the residue of pesticides, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are today. I know a lot of those concerns are valid, and in my opinion, at least, it seems like there's a lot more concern over GMOs lately than there used to be, and for good reason, a lot
Right.
of these concerns.
Yeah, there's just not been enough time to study what is actually happening with those, in my opinion.
For sure.
And at the same time, I want to touch back on that Silent Spring comment because I read that book in college. I don't know if you had a chance to ever read
I
it.
didn't.
It's exceptional.
Interesting.
And it's fascinating because they talk about DDT, which is a pretty big pesticides. If you ever get off spray for the woods or the superpowered off for mosquitoes, that has DEET in it, very similar compound for killing insects. And the issue is like you spray so much of it, it just ends up in the runoff. And then very much like large fish have a lot of mercury from eating smaller things in the food chain, that just built up and built up and built up in fish. And they were able to determine that there's all this DDT in the fish in the lakes. And Silent Spring also talks about like trucks of DDT literally driving through neighborhoods and plumes of smoke coming off of it because they wanted to kill the mosquitoes in these neighborhoods and just aerating the entire neighborhood basically. And when you look at that and you just think like back now, like we know better now, but at the time they really didn't know. And going even further back, I mean, everything just happened to be done organically. At some point, we just figured, profit over people, which was probably going to be a pretty common running theme through a lot of these conversations that we have. It's amazing to see people, to your point, being super conscious of what they're putting in their body and for good reason. I mean, I know you're conscious of it. I know I am. I wish it made me look a little bit better,
Ben,
but that's a
you look
personal
great.
problem. Oh,
So, organic is a loaded word.
Right.
And I think we're going to try to break it down a little bit, give people, a clear understanding. I mean, some of the things are pretty obvious, like some of the benefits of organic are strictly related to the environment. Organic farming tends to be much better for the environment. It generally is going to reduce pollution. It conserves water, reduces soil erosion, increases soil fertility, uses less energy. And we're not even talking right now about, specific animals that are better for the environment to raise. We're just talking about your basic
Practices,
anything, but
yeah.
beef, pork, chicken, all this generally applies. So that's great. And of course you have no antibiotics, no growth hormones, no steroids, and all organic food and meat, like I mentioned in the definition, is GMO free by nature. So what's interesting, or just an interesting point, something can be GMO free and not organic, but not the other way around. So anything that has any GMOs in it, immediately not organic.
we really should get through the challenges of things being organic because that's the hot button issue. And I think people nowadays even more, they're thinking, is the organic labeling really certifying a truly organic problem? And I get why people are concerned. I mean, we were talking before we even went on the air that companies bring in organic, quote unquote, organic product from overseas, especially grain, things out of Ukraine or out of Turkey, that's labeled organic and fed to animals in the US because they have to have organic feed for the meat to then be labeled organic. But they aren't going to the same standards that the USDA has, and they're not being inspected properly when they're hitting the dock. And there's even been cases of organic fraud in the US markets for grain. And I think that makes people uneasy. But to what you were talking about earlier is that this is a pretty new thing in the industry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that before we started recording, but if you think about it, I mean, you know, organic has been around for our entire lifetimes, right? So, but literally.
Yeah, literally.
So it doesn't feel, I mean, it just feels like it's always been there. But when I was, you know, doing some of this research, I was kind of surprised and I was like, oh, wow, it's not actually that old. We haven't been doing it for that long. And, you know, what you mentioned about the import, that's a big problem, but not necessarily for lack of want or care to fix it. I mean, a lot of the problems are just related to the scale of resources that are available. So the NOP, the National Organic Program, is a USDA subdivided unit that regulates all the organic crops and livestock, but they don't even have that many resources available for the volume of things that are coming in. I mean, the amount of, you know, inspection agents that they have available, it's they can't possibly.
What was the number? Was it 4 that they had?
I think it was 4 or 7. I can't begin to tell you why. 4 I don't have it written down.
inspectors. I mean, that's.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, the companies and the farmers that are buying this organic product from overseas, I certainly can't speak to their intentions because I don't know them personally. But, I know in my research, it was basically this ship of grain is coming from wherever. We don't track the ship, so we don't have a way to verify exactly where it's coming from. And the piece of paper that came with it has an organic stamp on it. So it automatically, as long as it's accepted, becomes, for all intents and purposes, organic by the USDA standard. And I mean, it's tricky too, because you mentioned inspections at the dock. And I know I was reading that, those people doing inspections, they're, control officers and, food and animal safety officers, and none of them are actually trained in organic and the signs to look for and what could be good, what might be a signifier that it is. So what can they do but to trust that stamp on that piece of paper?
Right. And I think that kind of gets eroded when people do their own research and they look and they see these conversations of fraud. And I guess kind of the point that we want to get at is that, yes, organic labeling is rife with issues in what it's doing, but because it's so new, there's always going to be some level of corruption. But organic is proven to be better for you. It's proven better for the animals. That's for sure. Proven better for the environment. And just because some things aren't working out immediately doesn't mean that we should say that all organic labeling is bogus or anything like that.
Oh, it's definitely not. And actually, what's a great thing to note is, every country has different standards for what organic is. And in fact, most of, I was browsing through some of them, and almost everywhere but the US, it might be everywhere, when they started implementing their version of organic and what it is, it was well after we did, at least 5 or 10 years. A lot of them are pretty recent. And, I know there has been talk and discussions of really trying to come to some sort of agreement or, an international type standard for what organic is. But what I do know is that every other country has either much more lax regulations and rules, or just in general, much more fraud and less people who either care or have the resources to stop it. So the United States, pretty much anything that's labeled organic, you can feel highly confident is. I mean, we are the best at it, I believe, for lack of better words.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because you have to have really hard conversations with farmers, and you have to be bothersome in a way. You have to ask them, what are you actually putting into your fields? Because that's another misconception, is that they're non-GMO and they don't use synthetic pesticides. But that doesn't mean organic produce doesn't use any pesticides, because they do use pesticides.
Yeah, just natural.
Yeah. And there's also the misnomer of antibiotics for animals, because they assume no antibiotics means that there's also no vaccines in the meat whatsoever. But that's also not true. They do use veterinarian recommended vaccines on these farms. If you have 1,000 head of cattle and they're all next to each other all the time, or even if they're on pasture and have the room to breathe, if one of them gets sick and then 10 of them get sick and that affects the entire herd of cattle, then they should be using safe vaccines to prevent that from happening. What's the alternative? That they just go ahead and slaughter 1,000 cattle? I mean, the avian flu is a great example of hearing 40 million chickens just being put to slaughter because they got sick. They used the word
destroyed, which really, that kind of shook me with the avian flu. They
dehumanizing.
However many hundreds of thousands of birds were destroyed. And that wasn't the farmer saying, yeah, let's do this, but that was legally mandated by the. All right, we're getting
the government came in.
We're getting off topic here. Not really getting off topic, but the avian flu is a separate conversation. So I mean, we're talking about who's in charge of putting these standards in place, and the USDA's organic label is overseen by the National Organic Standards Board, which is a group of 15 people, but they're very diverse people. You have scientists, environmentalists, public interest advocates, researchers. So they kind of oversee that label. I thought that was really great that it's not just, like a popularity contest or something for who's on the board. It's people who know what they're talking about. They know the importance of this and the factors that can affect it. And, the natural and organic food industry is by far the fastest growing industry, in the world. And I'm very glad for that. I just I want us to, like you were saying, kind of don't give up on organic. You definitely shouldn't. We have no reason to. I mean, I think the goal of this podcast is generally, this episode rather, is to talk about, okay, what's organic? What are some of the benefits? And what are some of the challenges? But, those challenges are absolutely beatable, especially being so, young in the game here.
Right. And that's the thing. I think that people in general, I mean, it's hard to look at things in a time scale as a human being when you're like 30, 40 years. We're both in our 30s. So we're talking about
Don't
something
remind me, please. Come on.
We're not getting old yet, but with organic being so new, and again, I think we're kind of hammering on the point a bit, is that there are people trying to do things the right way. Yes, there's going to be fraud. Yes, there's going to be issues. But people in an industry, I mean, if the incentive is money, the incentive for the people doing it right is also to prevent the level of fraud. People do care. And simultaneously, I think looking at some of the certifications that people get, or like some of the ways that people get around the certifications, again, are things that we know because people who care went out there and they're like, well, you can't actually do it this way. You can't just let the outside of your field of crops not have any pesticides or herbicides, so it looks, quote unquote, like you don't use any. And then you go into the center of that field and it's riddled with pesticides and herbicides. I mean, that's one of a few things, but to imagine every farmer that's trying to do organic is doing that way, I think is disingenuous. I think people like to demonize organic and organic labeling, but that is a hard label to get. There are some thorough standards for it.
Yeah. I mean, and like I said, and I read this in several articles, at least in this country, if you see the organic label on something, you can be pretty darn well sure that that's organic. And that's, I mean, that is when you're shopping at the grocery store, right? But the other tricky piece, and this does frustrate me because it comes back to just the integrity of people as human beings, is, a restaurant can literally write anything on their menu, guys. Absolutely anything. They can call anything organic. And ask yourself who's coming by to verify that. No one. No one is. I mean,
no one's coming to save us except us.
Yeah, I have literally been to a restaurant where I know where the product is coming from. I know exactly where it's coming from, and I see it labeled as organic, and I'm sitting there like, should I tell them that they're lying to everyone? And so the tough part is, at the end of the day, at least right now, the onus falls on us as individual consumers to really verify what we're eating. And I mean, I've heard stories of people really going above and beyond. It's hard and frustrating, and a lot of people might not, but if you're at a restaurant and come hell or high water, you got to verify if that's organic. I mean, you're going to be on the phone with the farmer or the processor sooner than later, because your server's just going to yes you.
Right.
That's what it is.
They're getting tipped. And that's really the inherent incentive, is that organic and, like you said, all natural, super, super fast growing industry. I mean, as far as food's concerned, like you said, easily the fastest growing one. But if you're doing things like almost organic in practice, like we've used that term before, not on the show, but in my day today, there's farms that don't want to pay to play. They don't want to pay for a certification. So they're just going to say we're organic in practice,
Yeah, organic
which
practice,
is not regulated. So they can say that. I work with a restaurant that carries wild boar from us. And you know what it says on the menu?
Organic.
It says organic wild boar chops. They're not organic. I've told them as much, but what can you do? You know what I mean?
Well, what's interesting about that is, so some wild boar on the market is 100% truly wild. But I believe somewhere I was reading that even wild animals can't be called organic, because chances are they've actually probably eaten something that has been contaminated by, or like even GMOs.
Right. Yeah. The field thing you were talking about. I know you ran into this issue with the customer who wanted to make sure there's no GMOs.
Yeah. And that, I didn't actually really realize this, until doing this research, but that comes down to just testing the product. So, a lot of times when farmers, are starting to try to get their organic certification, they pay a certifying agency to come out, and they basically come and verify everything. And very often, I don't believe it's a requirement, it should be, but most of the time, I believe they are actually testing the grain or the meat or whatever it is, and it can be directly tested for GMOs,
Right.
and basically a positive or negative result
Yeah.
come up as a result of it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I GMOs are kind of a hot button topic, but to me, I don't know all there is to know about GMOs. So
Right. Exactly.
I thought that was interesting. And I know like our focus is generally on proteins, but another thing I found, which maybe can be another ray of sunshine for the consumer, the listeners, that there are what they call the dirty dozen. And these are 12 fruits and vegetables that are most likely to be contaminated with some kind of pesticide or anything. I didn't write them down. Sorry, guys. But if
I wish you did.
If you Google
I'm thinking
it,
apples. That was the first one.
blueberries
popped
are
in my head.
definitely one of them. I think I was eating blueberries when I saw the article. I was
Oh, no.
very disheartened. But so those are things that's generally recommended. Go for organic. And then there's also the Clean 15, which are 15 fruits and vegetables that are least likely to be contaminated. And that's kind of a cool thing. If you don't necessarily have buku bucks, falling out of your pocket, it's a good tool to reference, at least as far as produce. I mean, meat is what it is. I don't believe there's any more or less likely. But you can spend that extra money where it's most likely to benefit you.
Yeah.
And then,
Feel safe.
yeah.
It's interesting. I've always heard the dirty dozen. Like I've known that's been a thing for a while, where there's definitely some produce that you probably shouldn't touch if your ethos is to not have pesticides or herbicides or
just buy
GMOs,
organic.
et cetera.
Those are the ones that you want to buy organic.
You definitely want to buy
You'd be good.
organic. And I've never heard the
Clean
what was it,
15.
Clean 15, which is interesting. I mean, it goes to show that a lot of people, the rage culture is a thing. People love to be angry these days. They love to hammer away at something and all the negativity of it. But to our point here, just in general, is that there are some options that are always going to be clean. And I did not know that. So I'm going to have to do my research afterwards.
And I think this, I'm not sure what you said that caused this, but this thought just occurred to me. I mean, we're talking about how new it is, right? And everyone wants to take the very best care of their children, right? Have them grow up strong and healthy in every way possible. And I'm thinking now, it's way too early to have any, concrete facts about this, but it's probably really important to feed growing children organic.
Right.
Much more so. I mean,
Or if you're
maybe.
pregnant.
I'm just kind of, I'm not a scientist. I'm just saying what I think, but it's probably huge. I mean, I know my brother and sister-in-law feed their boys organic pretty much everything, and they're very careful with the products that they bring into their home. And
He's a big boy. Maybe it's
Well,
the
he
organic
is.
produce.
And no, but I seriously think, we talked about how organic has proven health benefits, and there are things that are present in non-organic products that are directly linked to diseases and like physical bodily issues. So it's probably huge to feed a child all organic when they're
Right.
growing up.
Yeah. And it all compounds over time, too.
Oh, here it is. Better for your health. Pesticides and GMOs have been found to cause disease in humans. And this is good. We discussed this when we were planning for the podcast. So in animal products, organic versions have been found to have more of the healthy fats and better fat ratios.
Right. Your
and things
omega
like that.
3s and 6s, right?
Yeah. And in general, products that are organic are tested to have more antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, enzymes, micronutrients. I mean, some of these, it's not, a landslide of difference, but if it's better for you and there's more of it, sounds good to me.
Yeah. And nutrient density is a big thing. I mean, if you're paying more money for it, but it has more in it, there's an inherent value
For sure.
for eating those products and none of the negative effects.
Yeah.
But I don't think people think of it that way. And I think we're so trained to look at the dollar amount of something and not find that added value. And that's kind of why they came up with the organic labeling in the first place. They were like, there is so much inherent value in doing things the right way and not using the pesticides. And how do you get that over to the consumers and how do you build the consumer trust? So when we have these conversations and we talk about that erosion of consumer trust in the labeling, you really have to go back and have those conversations with consumers, be like, this labeling, you might hear about things in the news, but you're hearing about it in the news because it's the exception to the rule, not because it is the rule.
So, you were mentioning how it's hard to justify that extra price tag. And I mean, honestly,
Not for me, but for most consumers.
well, no, the next words out of my mouth were honestly, I'm guilty of that sometimes. You know, I mean, it can be twice as much or more for organic products. I mean, meat wise, everything I eat is pretty much raised with organic principles, and I'm okay with that. But produce, it's sometimes hard for me to justify. And, a lot of people might not fully understand why organic is so much more. And there's a lot of reasons that seem super obvious. But when I was doing this research, I was like, oh yeah, duh.
Yeah.
That you can't use pesticides or herbicides. So,
So you
all
have
the-
pests and herbs.
yeah,
you have weeds.
all the fields are completely haggard and overgrown. Literal people have to go out and weed the fields. I mean, if you've ever had a garden, you know how frequently you have to weed it. It is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So the amount of extra time and work that goes into just growing products. Now, look to animal protein.
Yeah.
There are grains that need to be grown to feed those animals.
Specifically for the labeling.
So
yeah.
you're going twofold. You have farmers working painstakingly to raise these organic grains, keep them free of insects and disease, because of insects, weed the frickin' fields. And then that expensive premium grain goes on to the dairy farmer or the pig farmer who is raising those animals on more land. So he has to own more land, first
Right.
of all. He is going to deal with some loss, of the animals just because of their natural condition. I mean, I guess you said the
right.
exact
Or
same
if
thing,
but even if they get sick, they're removed from the program, or they're going to be put down because they don't want to get the rest of the animals sick. So to your point, not having some heavily inoculated animal means that it is more likely to die.
yeah, exactly. And I believe, I think I'm right. I believe that you need to work with a certified organic processing plant. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's accurate.
Maybe.
And that's a whole other piece of it. So at the end of the day, creating these products and bringing them onto your tables and onto the shelves takes way more time, way more work, way more effort, and way more space.
Yeah. And the yield is lower. Don't forget.
And the
also.
yield is
Yeah.
much
Which
lower
is
because there's no
huge,
hormones
Yeah.
or steroids or anything.
Same amount. Let's say you use the same 100 acres and you're only getting 80% off of it instead of 95%.
hmm
That's a huge amount of money, especially for something that costs you more to make. And maybe your margins are thinner because you're in a more competitive market. I mean, there's so much nuance that goes into this, and farmers have it hard enough as it is. So they want to get you not only a really high quality, good for you product, but they also have to make a living off of it too.
hmm
And there is that incentive that they might get paid a little bit more, but is that bridging the gap? It's hard to tell.
Yeah. And I think, tying all of this into, I've been reminded several times during this conversation about our episode on sustainability. And there are a lot of familiar tie-ins. And I mean, in general, our conversation about food and, everything about it and the goods, the bads, the uglies, there are things that are better for the environment and for us and for the longevity of the earth and our species at the base of it. And like organic, one of the great things about it is the sustainability aspect. And that's
Yeah.
another reason to buy those products is your care for the environment.
Right.
And also the importance of supporting small farmers, because the larger companies that have an organic line or something like that, they don't care as much about that line as the smaller farmers do, because it makes up 2% of their business.
Right.
And, they don't really, not that concerned about growing it. It kind of just is what it is.
Yeah. They're like, yeah, maybe it's organic. And that kind of misconstrues the labeling or the strength of the labeling as well.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, at the end of the day, organic is awesome. Support organic. And I look forward to seeing it growing and the development and laws and legislation. And I look forward to tying this in with our greater conversation, if you will.
I'm with you on that. It's all encompassing. Part of me also wants to stay on topic and I inherently jump around, but that's because it is a spider web, right? It's
For
not
sure.
one thing or the other,
Yeah.
but we'll get into it deeper too.
We'll get into a lot of topics and a lot of rambling on the part of one of us, possibly. But anyway, that is episode 3 for you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe. It makes us like you a great deal. And we'll see you next time.